Imagine, tonight, as darkness falls, you are transported back in time to the cold ice age, where a strange and powerful species reigned, Homo neanderthalensis, our ancient cousins, both muscular and intelligent, and much misunderstood for thousands of years. Don't think they were just cavemen growling in the rocks. They were nature's gym athletes, with bodies that seemed to be cast from steel and a taste for cave decoration that would leave even modern architects in awe. They didn't just survive the Ice Age, they transcended it. It's as if every morning they woke up, stretched, and pushed back the blizzard. Before continuing this journey, try lying down, turning off the lights, and turning on the fan to hear the rustling wind in the background, like the breath of an ancient forest. Because we're about to enter the land of the Neanderthals, creatures who could wrestle with mammoths and not lose. If you were to stumble across Europe 80,000 years ago, you would probably freeze into a living statue within half a minute. But in that final moment, you might catch the eye of a Neanderthal, the dominant creature of the food chain, the one whose mere sight would make cave bears think twice about picking a fight. They weren't like us. They were specially upgraded versions of themselves designed to withstand nature's punishments. Imagine a human designed by three groups of experts: a bodybuilder, an Arctic engineer, and a fan of large foreheads. Voila, that's a Neanderthal. They were shorter than us, only about 5 feet 2 inches to 5 feet 6 inches, but calling them short would be a mistake. They weren't small, they were compact. A compact mass of muscle, shoulders as wide as barn doors, chests so huge they could hold a blizzard. Their bones were so thick, so heavy, so strong that they seemed built for smashing rocks, not just walking. Their hands were large and powerful, their thumbs so thick they could easily grasp tools, tear apart prey, or open screw-top jars that would be beyond modern humans' grasp. And their faces, oh, they weren't weird. Our faces were weird. They had low foreheads, long skulls, and strong cheekbones and high noses, like natural heaters to warm the icy air before breathing it in. Their chins were almost gone, which gave them a perpetually pensive or quarrelsome expression. But make no mistake, they weren't stupid thugs. This wasn't a failed human design. It was a double success, a species finely tuned to the exacting specifications of a deadly, frozen world. They didn't just survive, they thrived. Neanderthals were the ultimate endurance athletes of their time. Whether their workout involved hunting woolly rhinos, facing cave bears, or running away from a blizzard with a pointed stick, their entire body seemed to scream, "Yeah, I've broken a few ribs. No big deal." If you've ever been proud of lifting a milk crate without breaking your back, sit down. Neanderthals were living fortresses. Their bones weren't just strong, they were medieval strong. They were so thick, they made modern human thigh bones look like cheap chopsticks. Their leg bones were short, thick, and incredibly strong, not for running marathons, but for climbing treacherous terrain while carrying half a reindeer on their shoulders. Their knee joints were flexed, perfectly adapted for squatting all day, building fires, chipping rocks, and butchering wild game. And their arms? They were terrifying. Their upper arm bones were already thick, but their forearms were even thicker, a rarity in the primate world. Not for showing off their abs on Instagram, but for wielding boulder-sized stone axes and dragging car-sized prey across the frozen steppe. Their rib cages, wide, flaring like industrial bells, enough room for giant lungs to breathe in the thin, frigid air of the icy plains. Their entire respiratory system was like a pair of ancient bellows, sucking in oxygen and spitting out power. Their skulls, more than just those legendary brow ridges. Their skulls were long, flat, and thick, with huge muscle attachments for their jaws and necks. They could probably chew frozen venison without blinking. But the price for this physique was faster maturation and a shorter lifespan than modern humans. Still, while they were alive, they took all the beatings of life: broken bones, worn joints, cracked skulls, like prehistoric action stars. And their brains? Huge. Really. About 1,500 cubic centimeters. Bigger than the average modern human brain. These dumb apes were actually packing some advanced mental engines, though not for calculating Excel spreadsheets. Bigger doesn't mean smarter, though. Blue whales have huge brains, but they haven't invented the sink yet. But Neanderthals didn't waste their brains. A large portion of their brains were devoted to vision and motor coordination, perfect for stalking deer in a blizzard without falling off a cliff. They probably had super-sensitive eyes. Think piercing eyes that cut through a whiteout, like prehistoric manga heroes, only hairier and with less inner dialogue. Although their prefrontal cortex, the center of abstract thought, was smaller than that of modern humans, they knew how to plan, collaborate, even create art. They painted caves, used ochre, and may have even painted their faces. The first contouring experts from 40,000 years ago, not TikTok. They migrated across Europe and Asia, from the arid steppes to the frozen tundra, and in each land they learned to take advantage of nature, making tools, building tents, inventing new tricks to hurt themselves with flint. In the past, we thought all their jewelry and art were imitating modern humans. But then we found jewelry and cave paintings that were older than anything Homo sapiens could do. Turns out we were late to the cave party. If there was a competition for who survived the worst, Neanderthals would not only win the prize, they would take the trophy home to use as a hammer to smash rocks. They didn't just survive the Ice Age, they were designed for it. Think about it. The kind of weather that freezes your nose hairs in 3 seconds. For Neanderthals, it was just a nice day. No heated floors, no hoodies, no hot cocoa. Just this powerful body, short, stocky, thick, perfect for keeping warm. Same with their arms and legs, short and thick to reduce heat loss. Even penguins would nod in approval. And that big nose, not for gossip, but to warm the cold air before it enters their lungs. And the injuries? Oh, they were plentiful. Broken arms, broken ribs, brain injuries, straight out of a professional bull rider's accident report. The bones told the story, trampled, fell, stabbed, and healed. Because Neanderthals didn't give up easily. They wrapped moss around their wounds, sat by the fire, waited, and then went hunting again. The most amazing thing. Despite all the brutality, they took care of each other. The evidence is in the skeletons of old people, disabled people, blind in one eye, paralyzed in one arm, who had survived for years after their injuries. That is, their kind cared for, helped, and nurtured the weaker ones. A display of compassion that went beyond mere survival instinct. Neanderthals also knew how to use fire. They built fires in the middle of their caves, stoked coals, and kept warm through the long winters. A way of saying to the cold, "Not today, Satan." The ash, charred bones, and red-hot rocks all show that they chose where to build fires, kept them carefully, and turned them into a survival tool. They may not have invented s'mores or grilled hot dogs, but Neanderthals mastered fire in a way that would have made an ancient Bear Grylls nod in admiration. Their lungs. It was nature's version of an HVAC system, built directly into their faces. A useful adaptation and a great excuse for having a face you could rest a brick on. Even their skin likely contributed to their icy resilience. While we can't know exact pigmentation, most scientists agree they probably had lighter skin tones to better synthesize vitamin D in low-light conditions. Because if you're going to survive 6 months of perpetual gloom, you'd better be able to wring sunshine out of a gray sky. Their lungs were likely enormous, needed to fuel bodies that were doing manual labor 24/7, climbing, hunting, hauling, carving, and occasionally inventing new ways to pull a muscle. That wide barrel chest wasn't for show. It was a prehistoric furnace. Clothing? Oh yes. They weren't running around in fur loincloths, unless they were into that. Evidence suggests Neanderthals wore stitched hides to insulate themselves from the cold. And stitching isn't simple. It means they planned ahead, created tools, and probably had some version of winter wear and slightly less winter wear. In short, Neanderthals weren't barely surviving the Ice Age. They were thriving in it. They weren't nature's underdogs. They were nature's snowplows, designed to march through the cold, grunting softly and wondering why the mammoths were always so dramatic about it. When you think of Neanderthal fashion, you probably imagine a single fur draped over one shoulder, maybe held on by a piece of vine, accessorized with a club, and a general lack of self-awareness. But real Neanderthal clothing was surprisingly sophisticated. Primitive, sure, but with more function than flair, and just enough chaos to make a medieval tailor weep. Let's be clear. Ice Age Europe wasn't a great place to experiment with fashion minimalism. If you went outside in winter wearing just optimism and vibes, you'd freeze solid before you could say saber-toothed mistake. So Neanderthals got clever. Evidence suggests they didn't just wrap themselves in animal skins like discarded couch covers. They processed hides, softened them, and stitched them together using bone needles. That's right. They were hand-sewing outfits out of deer and mammoth before buttons were even a concept. And they didn't even complain on Reddit. And let's talk about accessories. Some Neanderthal sites contain eagle talons, pierced shells, and beads. These weren't strictly functional, which implies they liked a little flair. Maybe a dash of symbolism. Maybe even some Ice Age swagger. Imagine a Neanderthal walking into camp like, "Yes, this claw necklace is real. Yes, I caught the bird myself. No, you may not touch it." They also used ochre, a naturally occurring red pigment, on their tools, bodies, and possibly even faces. Was it war paint, decoration, some kind of social signal? No one knows for sure. But it does mean that at some point, a Neanderthal looked at a red rock and said, "This would look incredible on my cheekbones." Now, were they ready for Fashion Week? Not unless the runway was covered in snow, lit by firelight, and followed by an intense hunt. But their clothing did what it needed to. It kept them warm, dry-ish, and protected from both the weather and judgmental Homo sapiens. Let's also not overlook the practical brilliance. Every outfit was biodegradable, locally sourced, and cruelty-based, because, well, hunting. That's sustainable Ice Age fashion. Neanderthals weren't just strong. They were punch-a-woolly rhino in the face strong. The kind of strength that makes you question whether physics was working differently back then, or if they were just born with a natural gym membership to the universe. Everything about their anatomy screams power. Their muscle mass was enormous, especially in the shoulders, arms, and legs. Areas needed for daily tasks like hurling spears, skinning animals, hauling carcasses, and occasionally moving boulders for fun. Their bone structure, as we've discussed, could support a small siege engine, which means those muscles weren't for show. They were functional gains. But how strong were they really? Estimates suggest a Neanderthal male could be up to 50% stronger than a modern human of the same size. And in terms of upper body strength, possibly even double. This isn't farm strong or dad strong. This is accidentally rip the door off your cave strong. They didn't just hunt from a distance with carefully thrown projectiles. No. Neanderthals preferred the close contact approach. They'd run up to large, angry Ice Age megafauna and jab them with spears at near point-blank range. Their version of dinner prep involved dodging tusks while keeping a firm grip on something that wanted them dead. And the wear and tear? Oh, it shows. Their fossil records are full of healed injuries, broken arms, crushed ribs, damaged skulls. All signs that they weren't just strong, but resilient. If a Neanderthal broke something, they either walked it off or wrapped it in moss and hoped for the best. Then they went right back to hunting. Even their grip strength was absurd. Some researchers believe they could crush modern humans' hands without trying. Their thumbs were larger, their fingers broader, and their knuckles capable of damage usually reserved for medieval weapons. If you're picturing the Rock, but fuzzier and more likely to throw a stone axe at you, you're not far off. If there's one thing Neanderthal fossils consistently tell us, it's that these people lived hard. Not forgot to wear sunscreen hard. More like tackled a raging bison before lunch hard. Their skeletons read less like quiet prehistoric memoirs and more like accident reports from an Ice Age rodeo. Seriously, when paleoanthropologists looked at the trauma patterns in Neanderthal remains, they noticed something oddly familiar. The types of injuries, fractured ribs, broken arms, crushed faces, were strikingly similar to those found in professional rodeo riders. And no, that is not a joke. Apparently, if you regularly tangle with one-ton mammals for a living, your bones tell a very specific kind of story. Take Shanidar 1, for example. This poor guy had a blow to the head that crushed part of his skull, probably left him partially blind, and also had a withered right arm, likely from a healed break. His foot was damaged too. Basically, he was the human equivalent of a walking before photo in an orthopedic ad. And yet, he survived for years after those injuries. That means other Neanderthals were taking care of him. Because apparently, even if you're a tank of a man with one working eye and a limp, your Ice Age buddies still make room for you at the fire. Neanderthals contributed more to modern humans than just survival instincts. Some of their genetic traits are linked to conditions like type 2 diabetes, depression, and nicotine addiction. So while your ancient cousins might have helped you escape a woolly mammoth, they might also share the blame for late-night snack runs and endless doom scrolling. Interestingly, African populations whose ancestors didn't interbreed with Neanderthals after migrating out of Africa have little to no Neanderthal DNA. Instead, they carry traces of other archaic humans like the Denisovans, making humanity's family tree less of a clean chart and more of a tangled, romantically chaotic shrub. Neanderthals thrived for nearly 300,000 years in harsh conditions. Ice Ages, saber-toothed predators, and even their own kind. They were the original Europeans. Then, roughly 40,000 years ago, they quietly vanished. No dramatic extinction event. No comet. Just fade to black. So what happened? One theory is climate change. As the last Ice Age shifted, Neanderthals struggled with changing environments. Large game became scarce, and even mammoths started behaving unpredictably. Another theory: competition with Homo sapiens. Modern humans brought long-distance weapons, a varied diet, and an irritating tendency to survive everywhere. They also reproduced faster and spread wider. Neanderthals, by contrast, had smaller, more isolated populations, leading to less genetic diversity, a serious disadvantage in the survival game. But this wasn't some grand violent overthrow. There's no sign of genocide or battles. Instead, Neanderthals and humans likely coexisted, shared genes, ideas, and probably awkward campfire chats, until pure Neanderthal populations faded out. Their final holdouts were likely in southern Iberia, in places like Gibraltar. There they lingered for a few thousand more years, the last flickers of an ancient flame. The archaeological record goes quiet. No new tools, no new burials, just stillness. Yet their legacy endures, not in monuments, but in DNA. For much of history, Neanderthals got terrible press. Early scientists painted them as brutish, stooped cavemen. A famous reconstruction even showed a Neanderthal standing like a gorilla, an image based on an elderly, arthritic skeleton. This stereotype stuck in pop culture. The truth? They buried their dead, made tools and jewelry, and possibly even created art. Only now are we correcting the record. Neanderthals weren't failures. They were a parallel success story. Different strategies, same struggle. None retreating from the world of steel and politics. Another tale claims she cut off her long warrior's hair, assumed a new identity, and vanished into the mountain monasteries of Nagano, never to be seen again. Yet another version hints that she continued to wander the countryside as a ronin, an unaligned warrior hired for private vengeance and borderland skirmishes, and then silence, centuries of it. The truth buried somewhere under folklore, scrolls, and oral tales may never surface. But Tomo's vanishing act became part of her power. By slipping out of history, she became immortal. She was no longer constrained by one ending, one role, or one version of femininity. Instead, she became a symbol of possibility. What makes her story even more enigmatic is how Japan itself evolved in her absence. The rise of the shogunate under Minamoto no Yoritomo marked the beginning of the Kamakura period, a rigid patriarchal era where women were pushed further into the background. Female warriors didn't vanish completely, but they were increasingly sidelined, romanticized, or erased. And yet Tomo endured. Not in the dusty scrolls of official history, perhaps, but in the stories mothers told their daughters and soldiers whispered around campfires. She became a ghost that haunted the samurai ideal, the woman who fought like 10 men, but answered to no one. Over time, poets, playwrights, and artists resurrected her, sometimes as a tragic lover, sometimes as an avenging demon, sometimes as the last true samurai, but always, always as a figure who defied expectations and left a trail of mystery behind her. Tomo Goen didn't just vanish, she transformed, and the silence she left behind roars louder than any death scene. As centuries passed, the woman once feared on the battlefield became something else entirely. A legend molded by poets, monks, and playwrights. In an era where women were expected to be invisible, Tomo Gozen became unforgettable. The Hake Monogatari, a sweeping semi-historical war epic compiled in the 13th century, was the first to etch her into cultural memory. But this text was never just a history book. It was performance. It was theater. Blind monks known as Biwa Hoshi traveled from town to town, chanting the stories of the Genpei War to the sound of the Biwa lute. Through their voices, Tomo Gozen was reborn, not just as a fighter, but as a tragic heroine. Later adaptations embellished her even further. In No and Kabuki theater, Tamo became a recurring figure, her beauty exaggerated, her loyalty dramatized, her battles stylized to perfection. She was often paired with doomed love stories, tearful farewells, and moral lessons about honor and duty. The audiences didn't just watch her fight. They wept for her, admired her, and feared her in equal measure. But this romanticization came at a cost. The real woman, the one who decapitated enemies and led cavalry charges, was gradually softened. Over time, her armor was traded for flowing kimono. Her swordplay became metaphors for feminine resilience. She became palatable, noble, tamed, and yet her image refused to die. Artists throughout the Edo period painted her riding into battle, face calm, blade poised. Samurai guides included her in lists of martial paragons. Sword schools invoked her name. Even as her story was mythologized, it still carried the sharp edge of the battlefield. In modern Japan, Tom Goen is often mentioned in the same breath as other legendary warriors: Musashi, Benkei, Yoshitsune. But unlike them, she carries the unique weight of gender defiance. She wasn't just an exception to the rule. She was a challenge to it. In every era since, women have looked to Mo as proof that their place is wherever they choose to stand, even if that's the heart of the battlefield. The further she drifted from fact, the closer she became to symbol. A woman who shouldn't have existed yet did. A warrior who couldn't be contained yet endured. And a story that refused to end. Tamo Gozen's blade may have been sheathed over 800 years ago, but her presence lingers, etched not only in legend, but in the cultural psyche of Japan and beyond. As generations passed, she became more than just a figure from the Jani War. She became a symbol of resistance, individuality, and the disruptive power of a woman who refuses to follow the script. During the Edo period, when samurai culture was formalized and ritualized into a strict code of conduct, Tamo's image was used both as inspiration and caution. Some saw her as an embodiment of ideal loyalty, a warrior who served her lord to the bitter end. Others, especially in patriarchal scholarly circles, saw her as a dangerous anomaly, proof that when women step beyond their prescribed role, chaos follows. But even those who feared her couldn't erase her. By the Meiji Restoration in the late 19th century, when Japan sought to modernize and define its national identity, Tomoe re-emerged in textbooks and public discourse, this time as a patriotic heroine. She appeared in children's books, school plays, and nationalistic art, often alongside male samurai legends. While the portrayal was sanitized, the fact remained. A female warrior had made it into the canon. In the 20th and 21st centuries, Tomo's legacy evolved once again. She became a favorite subject for manga artists, video game developers, feminist scholars, and filmmakers. In a media landscape full of cookie-cutter characters, Tomo stood apart. A woman whose legend wasn't based on romance, but on combat. She wasn't the lover left behind. She was the one who picked up the sword and fought forward. Modern portrayals of Tomo reflect shifting attitudes. Some cast her as a feminist icon, others as a tragic figure of unfulfilled destiny. Some present her as a warrior spirit haunting the battlefields. No matter the interpretation, she is always strong, always complex, and always just beyond the reach of complete understanding. Even in politics and education, Tamo has become shorthand for defiance. Schools are named after her. martial arts dojo cite her in their lineage. She appears on stamps, posters, and even anime storylines. Her name invoked whenever someone needs to prove that a warrior's soul can come in any form. She may have fought one war, but her presence continues to rally people across every battle for identity, justice, and place. Tomoe Gozen never asked to be remembered. She didn't leave behind memoirs, letters, or poetic reflections. She left behind the only thing that truly mattered to a warrior of her age: a legacy forged in blood, loyalty, and fire. And in doing so, she achieved something few in history ever manage: immortality without asking for it. Unlike many women of her time, Tama wasn't preserved because she fit society's ideals. She was preserved because she broke them. Every time she swung her blade on a battlefield, swarming with men who thought her unworthy, she rewrote the rules of feudal Japan. And though she vanished into obscurity, her absence only made her story louder. In a culture where silence often defined a woman's worth, Tomoe's silence after a wazoo has become its own kind of roar. The absence of concrete facts surrounding her fate has given generations of artists, scholars, and revolutionaries permission to fill the void with meaning. She has become the embodiment of possibility, proof that one can defy the structure and still become legend. Her name lives on not just in literature and pop culture, but in the spirit of every woman who refuses to be invisible. Every athlete who pushes beyond her limits. Every leader who's told she's too bold. Every fighter who doesn't wait for permission to stand her ground. Tomo Goen isn't just a historical figure. She's a standard bearer of defiance wrapped in silence. Today, statues of her stand in Nagano and across Japan. Schoolgirls study her in history classes. Cosplayers dress as her at anime conventions. Martial artists whisper her name as they train with the Naginata. She even appears in international games and series, reminding global audiences that the archetype of the female warrior isn't fiction, it's history. And yet, her greatest power may lie in the fact that we still don't fully know her. Was she a concubine turned general? A foster daughter raised in the art of war? A lone ronin who walked into the mountains and never looked back? We may never uncover the full truth, but maybe that's the point. Tomo Gozen was never meant to be one story. She was meant to be many, not bound by records nor erased by time. Just eternally riding, sword drawn into the legend she forged herself. Before satellites lit up the sky and compasses pointed north, ancient mariners stared out over endless horizons and asked the boldest question of all: what's out there? These weren't reckless fools. They were engineers, navigators, and dreamers, and with little more than the stars overhead and the winds in their sails, they carved sea routes that would become the first arteries of global connection. Humanity's relationship with the sea began tens of thousands of years ago. Some of the earliest evidence of watercraft dates back over 40,000 years, long before the agricultural revolution. Even then, early humans were already using rafts to reach distant islands like Australia, which required crossing hundreds of miles of open ocean. These were not lucky accidents. They were planned journeys made with a clear understanding of tides, winds, and celestial patterns. By 3000 BCE, maritime technology was flourishing. Cultures in Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, and along the Nile were already using boats for trade and fishing. But it wasn't until certain cultures took to the high seas that true oceanic navigation began. These early seafarers faced enormous challenges. No maps, no written instructions, and often no guarantee they'd ever return. And yet they went, driven by necessity, curiosity, and survival. They read the waves like a book. They observed how clouds formed over islands, how birds flew at certain times of day, and how the stars rotated across the sky. The night sky in particular became their greatest tool. Polaris in the northern hemisphere, for instance, served as a fixed point for orientation. In the southern hemisphere, navigators watched the Southern Cross. These seafarers learned to feel the subtle push of currents beneath their hulls. They learned the sound of the wind in their sails, and most impressively, they passed this knowledge down orally for generations through chants, stories, and sacred traditions. Their tools weren't compasses or astrolabes. Their tools were memory, observation, and intuition. This wasn't just survival. It was science before science had a name, a way of knowing the world that married nature and culture. And as they set out across unknown waters, these ancient mariners weren't just navigating oceans. They were laying the foundations for global trade, migration, and the first connections between civilizations that had never even heard each other's names. Long before the rise of Athens or the glory of Rome, the island of Crete was home to one of the most sophisticated seafaring civilizations the ancient world had ever seen, the Minoans. Flourishing from around 2000 to 1450 BCE, the Minoans weren't just islanders. They were maritime architects who turned the sea into a superhighway of culture, commerce, and control. At the heart of Minoan power was the city of Knos, a sprawling palace complex adorned with vibrant fresco of dolphins, ships, and sea life. These weren't decorative flourishes. They were declarations. The Minoans lived and breathed the sea. Their economy thrived on maritime trade, and their influence stretched across the Aegean, reaching Egypt, the Levant, and beyond. Unlike later Greek navies built for war, Minoan ships were designed for speed and stability, ideal for trade and diplomatic missions. Their vessels, often decorated with bird or bull motifs, used square sails and rowers to navigate the calm yet unpredictable Mediterranean. These ships carried everything from olive oil and wine to pottery and bronze. But more than goods, the Minoans carried ideas, art, religion, and technologies, dispersing them like waves across the Aegean. And how did they navigate? While there are no surviving Minoan navigational charts, archaeologists believe they relied on a combination of star-based navigation and visual markers, coastal headlands, the color of the water, bird flight paths. Their consistent returns from long journeys suggest a deep understanding of seasonal winds and maritime rhythms long before anyone wrote them down. One of the most remarkable signs of Minoan maritime prowess is their role in the development of the Greek alphabet. By interacting with Near Eastern cultures like the Phoenicians, the Minoans helped pave the way for one of history's most influential scripts. Their ships weren't just they were floating vessels of cultural exchange. But like many sea-based powers, their end may have come from the very ocean they mastered. Around 1450 BCE, a volcanic eruption on the nearby island of Thera, modern-day Santorini, may have triggered tsunamis and ash clouds that devastated Minoan ports and destabilized their control. Whether by nature or invasion, their ships eventually disappeared from the waves. Still, the Minoans left behind more than ruins. They left behind a legacy of what it meant to rule not by land, but by sea. If the Minoans were the artists of the sea, then the Phoenicians were its tireless entrepreneurs. From around 1500 BCE to 300 BCE, the Phoenicians, a loose confederation of city-states like Ty, Sidon, and Byblo, dominated the eastern Mediterranean, not with armies, but with fleets. Their legacy isn't one of empires and conquests. It's one of navigation, trade, and the spread of culture across the known world. The Phoenicians didn't have a unified kingdom or grand capital. What they had were ships, and lots of them. These were sleek, fast, and highly maneuverable vessels capable of long, deep distance trade. Using both square sails and banks of OES, their ships could hug coastlines or dart across open water. And with them, they brought glass, cedar wood, purple dye, and most importantly, ideas. They were the middlemen of the ancient world, linking Egypt with Anatolia, Greece with Mesopotamia, and North Africa with the Western Mediterranean. They established outposts and colonies across the coastlines, most famously Carthage in North Africa, which would later rise to rival Rome. Each colony acted like a node in a vast maritime network, with the mother cities back east reaping the benefits of trans-Mediterranean commerce. But how did they manage to sail such distances with no compass or sextant? Like their Minoan predecessors, the Phoenicians used the stars, particularly Polaris, the North Star, as their guide. They also understood prevailing wind patterns, coastal features, and current behavior. Many scholars credit them with developing one of the first systems of celestial navigation in the Western world. Yet their greatest contribution wasn't something they carried. It was something they invented: the alphabet. The Phoenician writing system, developed around 1050 BCE, was a revolutionary leap. An alphabet of just 22 characters representing sounds rather than entire words or syllables. This script would go on to inspire the Greek, Latin, Hebrew, and Arabic alphabets. Through this linguistic breakthrough and their seafaring tenacity, the Phoenicians didn't just trade, they connected. They turned the sea from a barrier into a bridge, linking cultures, languages, and economies. And they did so not by colonizing hearts and minds, but by sailing from one to the next. The Mediterranean wasn't just their highway, it was their identity. While the Mediterranean world was abuzz with Phoenician traders and Greek triumphs, an entirely different maritime saga was unfolding on the opposite side of the planet. One of outriggers, double-hulled canoes, and stars charted across the largest ocean on Earth. These were the Aranesian seafarers. And they didn't just sail the seas. They colonized half the planet's surface without metal tools, maps, or written language. Originating from what is now Taiwan around 3000 BCE, the Aranesians expanded steadily southward and eastward, hopping from island to island with astonishing speed. By 1500 BCE, they had reached the Philippines, Indonesia, and the edges of New Guinea. By 1000 BCE, they were in Micronesia and Melanesia. And by the 1st centuries CE, they had reached as far as Madagascar to the west and Easter Island to the east. An arc of human migration that spans over 10,000 meters. Their vessels were marvels of engineering. Aranesians developed outrigger canoes for stability, and later double-hulled voyaging canoes capable of carrying families, livestock, and cargo across thousands of miles of open ocean. They harnessed wind through crab-claw sails and used paddles for precision near islands. But what truly set them apart was their unparalleled skill in navigation. They used the sun, moon, planets, and more than 200 stars as guides. But that's just the beginning. Aranesian navigators, especially the famed Polynesian wayfinders, read the ocean like a living map. They could detect subtle changes in wave patterns caused by distant islands reflecting swells. They followed seabird flight paths, studied cloud formations, and even tasted sea air for salinity shifts. near land. This wasn't instinct. It was highly refined science passed down orally through chance and memory devices. Their migration wasn't random exploration. It was intentional and repeatable. Leda pottery, a distinctive cultural artifact, marks their path across the Pacific, showing how interconnected their world truly was. They weren't just island hoppers. They were civilization builders, spreading agriculture, languages, and technology wherever they landed. And in many ways, they still are. Modern genetic studies, linguistics, and archaeology continue to uncover just how advanced and expansive Aranesian navigation was. These mariners didn't just cross oceans. They connected some of the most remote corners of the Earth long before European explorers ever left port. In the Pacific, the sea was never a void. It was a roadmap. When we think of ancient Egypt, towering pyramids and desert tombs usually come to mind, not ships. But the Egyptians were no strangers to water. The Nile was their lifeline, their highway, and their first school of navigation. Yet, what's often overlooked is how the Egyptians extended their maritime reach far beyond the riverbanks, venturing into the Red Sea and possibly even further afield. Egypt's mastery of the Nile began early. As far back as 3000 BCE, they built large wooden boats with planks lashed together by rope and sealed with resin. These vessels, propelled by both sails and oars, were essential for transporting goods, soldiers, and grain across the vast stretches of the river. But the Nile was only the beginning. By the time of Pharaoh Hatshepsut in the 15th century BCE, Egypt was launching sea expeditions from ports along the Red Sea. Her famous voyage to the mysterious land of Punt, possibly located in modern-day Somalia, Eritrea, or southern Arabia, was a landmark in ancient maritime history. Reliefs from her mortuary temple at Deir al-Bahari show detailed depictions of large cargo ships loaded with exotic animals, incense trees, and gold, all returning from a successful voyage across the sea. These weren't accidental drifts. They were carefully organized missions planned with knowledge of monsoon wind patterns, currents, and seasonal timing. Egyptian sailors would have hugged coastlines, used star patterns for navigation, and relied on maritime scouts, perhaps even recruiting skilled local sailors from the Red Sea region. Some theories even suggest Egyptian contact with the Indus Valley via indirect maritime trade, especially during the peak of Mesopotamian Indus-Egyptian interaction. While direct evidence is limited, items such as ivory, lapis, lazuli, and spices hint at a broader Indian Ocean trade network, in which Egypt may have played a part. The ships themselves were engineering marvels for their time. Built from imported cedar wood, mostly from Lebanon, Egyptian seafaring vessels featured curved hulls and large square sails. These ships could carry heavy loads and withstand the swells of the Red Sea. Though the Egyptians never became a dominant naval power like the Phoenicians, they left an important legacy. They were among the first to treat maritime voyages as royal, sacred, and strategic endeavors. Their sea journeys were extensions of their empire, diplomacy, and divine authority. On land, they built pyramids, but on water, they launched ambition. Amid the dusty plains of modern-day Pakistan and northwest India, once thrived one of the world's oldest urban civilizations, the Harappans, or the Indus Valley Civilization. Flourishing between 2600 and 1900 BCE, they built cities with advanced sanitation, standardized bricks, and remarkable urban planning. But buried beneath this archaeological brilliance is another truth, one less spoken but deeply significant. The Harappans were maritime traders. Unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia, the Harappans left behind no deciphered writing, no grand naval reliefs, and no epic tales of sea voyages. Yet clues of their maritime prowess quietly dot the archaeological record. Excavations at Lothal, a major Harappan port city in Gujarat, revealed what many believe is one of the world's earliest known dockyards. Measuring 218 meters long with floodgates and channels, it connected to an ancient river that flowed to the Arabian Sea. Proof that Harappan engineers weren't just thinking inland, but outward. Artifacts tell the rest of the story. Harappan seals and goods, beads, ivory, ceramics have been found in Mesopotamia, specifically in the Sumerian cities of Lagash. Adian texts refer to a distant land called Meluha, likely the Indus region from which boats arrived bearing exotic goods. In return, the Harappans received silver, tin, and lapis lazuli, suggesting a complex trade network stretching from the Persian Gulf to the broader Near East. But how did they sail? While no complete Harappan ships survive, miniature models, terracotta boats, and carved depictions suggest the use of flat-bottomed rivercraft and seagoing vessels. They likely used the same seasonal monsoon winds that would later drive Arabian and Indian traders across the Indian Ocean. Harappan mariners probably hugged coastlines, stopping at natural harbors and estuaries, and navigated using celestial cues and current patterns. Unlike the warrior-focused empires of their time, the Harappans were remarkably peaceful. Their cities show little evidence of warfare or fortifications. This makes their maritime connections even more intriguing. They weren't conquering foreign shores. They were connecting them through trade and diplomacy. And then around 1900 BCE, the civilization began to decline. Rivers shifted, trade dwindled, and cities were abandoned. Their script faded with them, leaving behind a silent question. Just how far did their ships sail? Though their voices are lost, the water trails remain, etched in harbors, seals, and silent stones. For the ancient Greeks, the sea wasn't just a pathway. It was destiny. Cradled by the Aegean, Ionian, and Mediterranean seas, Greek civilization emerged in a world where sailing was as essential as farming. From the age of Homeric epics to the height of Athenian naval dominance, the Greeks turned maritime culture into art, science, and strategy. Their earliest stories, those of Odysseus battling sea monsters and Jason chasing the Golden Fleece, weren't mere myths. They were reflections of a people intimately tied to the sea. Greek city-states like Athens, Corinth, and Rhodes all relied on the ocean not just for trade, but for identity. Their gods had dominion over waves. Their heroes set sail. Their empires floated on hulls of wood and ambition. By the 8th century BCE, Greek colonists were setting out across the Mediterranean, founding cities from Sicily to the Black Sea coast. These colonies weren't military outposts. They were trade hubs, cultural satellites, and vital ports in a vast economic web. Goods flowed both ways. Olive oil, wine, and pottery from Greece, grain, metals, and slaves from afar. To navigate, Greek sailors relied heavily on coastal sightlines, the stars, especially the rising and setting of specific constellations, and oral navigation knowledge passed through generations. Their ships evolved from simple merchant vessels to formidable war machines like the Try, a sleek three-tiered galley rowed by up to 170 men and armed with a bronze battering ram. The Try was more than a ship. It was a floating expression of Athenian democracy and power. At its peak in the 5th century BCE, Athens boasted the most powerful navy in the ancient world. The Dian League, originally a defensive alliance against Persia, became an Athenian-led maritime empire. Their navy ensured control over sea lanes, tributes from allied cities, and the free flow of resources into Athens, feeding its golden age of philosophy, architecture, and drama. But with power came vulnerability. The Peloponnesian War against Sparta saw Athens' over-reliance on sea dominance backfire. Naval defeats, blockades, and internal strife brought about its downfall. Still, the legacy endured. Greek maritime innovations in seagraphy, celestial navigation, and shipbuilding laid the groundwork for Roman and later European seafaring. And their belief that the sea was a stage for glory, knowledge, and tragedy echoes in Western thought even today. For a people who started as landlocked farmers and shepherds, the Romans were late to embrace the sea. But once they did, they didn't just join the naval powers of the ancient world, they crushed them. The Mediterranean, once a patchwork of rival fleets and scattered colonies, became what the Romans proudly called Mare Nostrum, our sea. Early Rome was no maritime superpower. The Etruscans and Greeks dominated Italy's coasts, while Carthage, founded by Phoenician settlers, ruled the western Mediterranean with the most formidable navy in the region. But everything changed during the Punic Wars. Faced with Carthage's naval superiority, the Romans made a bold move. They reverse-engineered a captured Carthaginian warship. In an astonishing feat of industrial determination, they built an entire fleet, hundreds of ships in mere months. But they added something uniquely Roman, the corvus, a boarding bridge that turned sea battles into land combat. This innovation played to Rome's strength in infantry, allowing legionaries to storm enemy ships as if they were charging a fortress. Victory over Carthage in the Punic Wars handed Rome not only naval dominance but also control over Sicily, Sardinia, Spain, and eventually the entire Mediterranean coastline. Roman GIs, both military and merchant, patrolled sea lanes transporting grain troops and exotic goods from Egypt, Gaul, Syria, and beyond. Ports like Ostia and Alexandria bustled with activity, turning the Mediterranean into a Roman highway. The Pax Romana, a period of relative peace lasting 2 centuries, was made possible largely through this maritime control. The sea, once a place of pirate fleets and clashing empires, became a stabilized zone of commerce. Grain shipments fed the capital. Luxury goods, silk, spices, pearls, flowed in from India and China via maritime routes stretching to the Red Sea and Persian Gulf. Roman sailors used a combination of dead reckoning, coastal sailing, and celestial navigation, aided by detailed maritime itineraries known as peripoli. Though lacking compasses, they mastered the rhythms of wind and current, especially the Etesian winds that made return voyages in the eastern Mediterranean predictable. Rome didn't just conquer by land, it sustained itself by sea. Its navy protected trade, enforced imperial will, and ensured communication across vast distances. With their fleets, the Romans did what no other culture had yet managed. They turned the chaotic sea into a controlled empire. Long before modern maps, compasses, and diesel engines, the ancient world was already connected by an invisible lattice work of sea routes, drawn not with ink, but with wind, memory, and stars. From the reed boats of the Nile to the double-hulled canoes of the Pacific, these early maritime cultures didn't just explore the seas, they defined them. and their legacy still lingers in every port, every trade route, and every ship that crosses the waves today. The knowledge passed down by Minoans, Phoenicians, Aranesians, Egyptians, and others became the bedrock of future navigation. These cultures discovered how to read the sky like a map, how to sail with the rhythms of the earth, and how to build ships that could survive months at sea, all without metal hulls or written charts. Their discoveries weren't isolated. They were cumulative. Each seafaring civilization learned from its predecessors or neighbors, contributing a new stitch in the tapestry of global navigation. Phoenician alphabets enabled the record-keeping necessary for complex maritime trade. Aranesian navigation traditions preserved orally for generations inspired 20th century efforts to revive wayfinding without instruments. Greek observations of the stars and winds laid the groundwork for ancient geography. Roman engineering gave us ports and lighthouses still echoed in today's harbor design. Even more significant than the tools were the connections. Maritime routes allowed ideas to travel faster than armies. Religions spread by sea. So did technology, crops, language, and diseases. The maritime cultures of the ancient world didn't just move objects, they moved civilizations. Without them, the ancient Silk Roads would have stopped at the shoreline. Without them, empires might never have risen, and distant peoples might have remained strangers forever. And yet, for all their accomplishments, so many of these early sailors remained nameless. Their stories were rarely written down. Their ships decayed and vanished. What survives are fragments. Pottery shards in a sunken cargo hold, a port structure buried beneath modern concrete, a star map etched on bone or bark, but their impact that still moves with the tide. Every container ship crossing the Suez Canal, every satellite-guided cargo run across the Pacific, every naval patrol in the Mediterranean owes something to those first brave souls who dared to chase the horizon. They may have been ancient, but they were never primitive. They were the original navigators of the human story. In the ancient world, royal birth was a blessing wrapped in a curse. The instant a child was born into a palace, they became more than a person. They became a symbol, a political weapon, and the future of an empire. Their education didn't begin in a classroom. It began in the nursery, surrounded by whispers of lineage, legacy, and looming threats. Unlike common children who learned survival through labor, elite children were groomed for leadership from the start. Every gesture they made, every word they spoke was watched, corrected, and crafted. Their lives were performances in training, rehearsals for thrones they had not yet earned. They didn't learn to read for leisure. They learned so they could read treaties. They didn't learn to speak to express themselves. They learned to command obedience, recite laws, and deliver carefully calculated flattery to foreign envoys. The content of their education depended heavily on geography and dynasty, but the goals were universal: control, charisma, and continuity. A Babylonian prince might be drilled in uniform by scribes, while an Egyptian heir would be introduced to priestly hieroglyphs, rituals, and sacred myths. In Greece, philosophy was essential. In Persia, etiquette was military. In China, Confucianism ruled the curriculum. Even their toys were political. Miniature weapons, board games simulating strategy, and symbolic animals reflected the roles they were expected to master. Tutors weren't just teachers. They were handlers, carefully chosen by the court. They were loyal, elite, and often expendable. If the royal child failed, it was the tutor who paid the price. The stakes were always high. A poorly educated heir was a national liability. A soft or ill-prepared child could become a pawn in the hands of enemies or ambitious relatives. Education then wasn't about personal development. It was about regime survival. But for all its strictness, royal education could also be dazzling. These children were exposed to astronomy, medicine, foreign languages, ethics, and art long before the rest of the world. Some of them became polymaths, statesmen, generals, and scholars, raised not just to rule, but to outshine every mind in the room. To be born royal in the ancient world wasn't just to be born lucky. It was to be born into a lifelong test, and education was the first battlefield. Behind every powerful ruler in the ancient world was often a far more obscure figure, the tutor. These weren't just glorified babysitters. They were philosophers, priests, generals, and political operatives. Their task to shape a child not just into an adult, but into a ruler, a diplomat, and sometimes a god. Few tutor-student pairings have echoed louder through history than that of Aristotle and Alexander the Great. Chosen by Philip of Macedon, Aristotle was tasked with turning the headstrong prince into something more than just a warrior. He taught him ethics, rhetoric, zoology, geography, and philosophy, and infused him with an insatiable hunger for knowledge. When Alexander later conquered the known world, he carried copies of Homer and philosophical texts with him, like sacred weapons. Aristotle hadn't just taught him facts. He had crafted the inner world of a future conqueror. But Aristotle was no exception. In the Roman Empire, Seneca, the Stoic philosopher and statesman, was assigned to tutor the young Nero. He tried to shape the boy with virtue, logic, and restraint. Unfortunately, history tells us that Nero grew into one of Rome's most infamous tyrants. The failure wasn't entirely Seneca's, but it showed how even the best teachers couldn't always overcome a student's darker instincts or courtly influence. In Persia, royal tutors were often military men chosen for their loyalty and their ability to instill discipline. Princes of the Achaemenid dynasty were taught hunting, horseback riding, and combat from the age of 7, alongside moral training in truthfulness and justice. All under the watchful eyes of elite mentors. Their education was practical, Spartan, and deeply political. In ancient China, Confucian scholars held enormous sway over the upbringing of princes. They instilled ideals of filial piety, hierarchy, and ritual. But woe to the tutor who taught the wrong thing. A slip of the tongue could lead to banishment or death if a lesson contradicted the emperor's doctrine. Being a royal tutor meant living in the shadows, shaping history through someone else's mouth and hand. They had to be wise but invisible, commanding yet differential. They walked a dangerous line. Get too close and they were envied. Fail and they were discarded. Succeed and their names lived on only if their students made history. While the sons and daughters of farmers learned from life, elite children of the ancient world learned from systems built behind palace walls, privatemies, temple libraries, and in some cases, secret priestly schools that protected knowledge like it was gold. Education for royals wasn't just about preparing for power. It was about controlling the flow of knowledge. the one thing more dangerous than armies. In ancient Egypt, priesthoods were the gatekeepers of education. Royal children, especially future pharaohs, were sometimes educated in temple schools where instruction included reading hieroglyphs, memorizing religious texts, understanding ritual practice, and learning astronomy and medicine. These were not skills shared with the general public. Literacy was rare, sacred, and only those destined to govern or interpret the divine were granted access. Much of this training was conducted in what we might call secret schools. Within temples like those at Karak or Heliopolis, knowledge was transmitted from priest to pupil in complete confidentiality. The curriculum wasn't just religious, it was political. Knowing how to recite spells, interpret omens, or plan rituals gave rulers control over life and death in the eyes of their people. Persia had its own elite educational structure. The sons of Persian nobility, especially those close to the king, were educated in what Herodotus called the king's school. Hidden from public view, these boys learned truth-telling, writing, archery, and leadership. They also absorbed Zoroastrian ethics and statecraft. This schooling wasn't just for princes. It was for future satraps, generals, and administrators. Men expected to control provinces and armies with unwavering loyalty. In India, royal children might attend gurukulas, secluded forest schools run by learned Brahmins. While commoners rarely had access, princes were often placed under the guidance of a single guru who taught them everything from Vedic hymns to martial skills. The education was holistic, spiritual, intellectual, and physical, and again, deeply hierarchical. Knowledge was tailored to caste, role, and destiny, even in Greece where education was more democratized in some cities. Elite children like those in Sparta or Athens received specialized training. Spartan royal sons were placed in the AOGG, the state-run military academy. Athenian aristocrats hired private tutors in logic, strategy, and rhetoric because knowing how to win a war was only half the battle. Knowing how to win an argument could be even more important. In all these worlds, knowledge wasn't merely taught. It was guarded, passed like a sword, meant only for those who could wield it. In the ancient world, royal women were rarely expected to lead armies or govern states. But that didn't mean their education was trivial. In fact, for many dynasties, the instruction of elite daughters was just as calculated and strategic as that of their brothers. Because royal women weren't only daughters, they were future queens, priestesses, political pawns, and sometimes power players. In Egypt, royal women could hold immense influence. Queens like Haps and Nefertiti didn't merely stand beside pharaohs. They ruled, built temples, and for royal children in the ancient world, education was more than a privilege. It was survival. If you couldn't defend your kingdom, someone else would take it. In Sparta, this belief was law. Royal sons entered the Agoj, the brutal military academy, at age 7. There they were stripped of comfort and trained in pain tolerance, endurance, hand-to-hand combat, and battlefield tactics. Even princes were not spared. They fought, bled, and survived alongside other Spartan boys, forging bonds that would serve them on the front lines. In Persia, royal boys were educated in the three noble skills: riding, archery, and truth-telling. Horsemanship was essential for both war and royal hunts, which doubled as military drills. Archery was not just a skill, but a symbol of discipline and leadership. A Persian prince who couldn't handle a bow was considered unfit to rule. India's warrior classes, such as the Kshatriyas, trained in Dhanurveda, the martial science. Royal children mastered swords, spears, maces, and bows, while also studying epic texts like the Mahabharata, which taught not only how to fight, but why to fight, and what honor required in the face of death. Egyptian and Mesopotamian princes learned chariot driving, spear throwing, and wrestling. Pharaohs, though often depicted theatrically smiting enemies, received real military training. Rulers led from the front. In Rome, the young patrician elite were schooled in both virtues, manly courage, and disciplina, discipline. They trained with wooden swords, practiced military formations, and studied the campaigns of past generals. Julius Caesar himself balanced scholarship with martial training from youth. Even Chinese princes, typically more insulated by court life, learned martial arts, archery, and horsemanship. A ruler was expected to embody both the civil, wen, and military virtues. Across every empire, military education for royals wasn't optional, it was essential. But war was only part of the curriculum. Court etiquette was a matter of life and death. A misplaced word could spark war. An unguarded glance could cause scandal. From China to Persia, courtly behavior was drilled into young royals. In Han China, princes memorized the laim, ritual codes dictating every social gesture. One breach could mean political ruin. In Persia, royal children mastered diplomacy and indirect speech, crucial in a palace teeming with spies. India's royal heirs studied the Arthashastra, a manual for statecraft and espionage. Greece and Rome valued charm, flattery, and reading hidden motives in public life. Even in Egypt, etiquette was divine. Pharaohs were gods in flesh, and every movement symbolized cosmic order. Espionage lay beneath every lesson. Tutors taught princes to test loyalty, detect deception, and uncover secrets, because survival in the palace meant watching as much as ruling. Royal education shaped not only individuals, but entire empires. A well-educated ruler could unite kingdoms and build legends. A failed one could doom a dynasty. Alexander the Great's conquests were rooted in Aristotle's teachings, instilling curiosity, debate, and a sense of destiny. In contrast, Nero had Seneca as a tutor, but became a cruel, paranoid emperor, proving that education was no guarantee of greatness. For royal women, the stakes were no lower. A queen could become regent or ruler. A princess could seal peace or ignite war. Cleopatra and Wu Zetian weren't exceptions. They were products of rigorous political and diplomatic education that kept them alive and in power. Even after their reigns, these royal educations left legacies in libraries, academies, and imperial systems. The child's training became the blueprint for future heirs. In the ancient world, the throne was inherited, but the wisdom to hold it had to be taught.